right, the big story this evening, which will potentially impact pretty much all of you watching. There are very few of us, I think, who have no exposure at all to any social media site or to an OTT platform or to a website where we consume information, be it news or anything else. Right from YouTube, Facebook, Twitter, etc. Social media, digital platforms as well as OTT streaming sites have become a big part of our lives. For some time now, there has been a discussion, a debate, not just in India actually, all over the world, on how these sites and these mediums of communication should be regulated. What laws do they fall under? Should a government have complete say on what is communicated on these platforms or not? How does it balance out with freedom of speech? And this is an ongoing debate. For some time now, we've known that regulations will come in India as well to fill this policy lacuna. Well, those guidelines have been out today, and they show a soft touch approach is what the government is saying. We will be discussing in detail what these guidelines are and what they mean both for users as well as publishers and social media intermediaries in different aspects. But first, let's listen in to what the ministers have said today.
सुप्रीम कोर्ट का फैसला है कि इंटरनेट इज नॉट ए फंडामेंटल राइट बाय इटसेल्फ, but the fundamental right of freedom of speech and expression under 19(1) can use internet to exercise that right. So if it is a fundamental right under 19(1), it is subject to 19(2) of the Constitution, which is reasonable restrictions can be imposed in pursuit of safety, security, sovereignty of India, public order, etc., etc. एक बात मैं ये कहना चाहूंगा, और दूसरी बात हम कहेंगे, सभी सोशल मीडिया का स्वागत है, लेकिन बड़े आदर से कहूंगा, there should not be double standards. If an attack is there on Capitol Hill in Congress, then social media support the police action. But there is an aggressive attack on Lal Killa, the symbol of India's freedom, where our Prime Minister hoists the national flag. You have double standard. This is plainly unacceptable.
Every freedom has to be responsible freedom. और उसके लिए we have decided to have 3-tier mechanism for OTT platforms. First, for OTT and digital news media, both will have to disclose their details from where they publish, how they publish, how much is this spread, anything. So that disclosure will come. That is first, information. We are not mandating a registration. We are seeking information. Then second is, there has to be grievance redressal system, as Raviji has said. Their grievance redressal system, in the same manner, it will work in OTT platforms and digital portals also. They will have to have their own portal for grievance redressal.
You through some of the key highlights of what these new guidelines will be. So first, for social media intermediaries, they have been divided into social media companies and larger social media companies based on the number of users, and the larger social media companies have more strictures to follow and more guidelines to follow. Overall, the government is saying that they believe in a soft touch oversight mechanism. So they will not come down hard, and they will give an opportunity to self-regulate. The important factor is that social media companies will have to have a grievance redressal forum for users. They have to take time-bound action on the complaints that come in. They have to remove objectionable content in 24 hours, and this content has been defined as anything which is punishable by law for up to 5 years. So actions which are punishable by law for up to 5 years. There has to be a monthly compliance report that these intermediaries will publish. They have to have a chief compliance officer residing in India, and very importantly, and this is the key one, they have to identify the first originator of mischief if asked about it. So that brings into question sites or services which have messaging and claim to have end-to-end encryption. They also say that they will have to have a nodal contact person who will coordinate with the authorities. They have to also allow voluntary clear verification of accounts. If they decide to block or ban someone's account for whatever reason, they have to give a clear hearing and they have to explain to that user why they have deemed to block their accounts. Let me now come to norms for OTT platforms. There will be a three-stair mechanism, so 3 layers of mechanisms which are formulated by the government. There will be a code of ethics that the OTT platforms will have to follow. They will have to classify content as 7 plus, 13 plus, 18 plus adult, and they also have to give a mechanism for parental control on these sites. There will be a self-regulating body as one of the layers. So the first layer is self-regulation, which the platforms will do themselves, the OTT platforms. The second layer will be a self-regulating body, which will be headed by a retired Supreme Court or High Court judge. And then the third layer will be which will have the government in place. So these are some of the norms that have been put into place. What do they mean? What do they mean for users? What do they mean for the overall system? To speak on this, we have a very interesting panel of speakers today. I'm joined today by Nikhil Pahwa. I have with me Arvind Gupta and Raman Chima. Welcome to all of you and thank you so much for speaking with us today. Let me come to you first, Arvind Gupta, and just get your sense of the overall guidelines which have come in. What has been emphasized time and again is that there should be a soft touch. Do you think with the guidelines in place there is scope for this soft touch oversight that the government is talking about today?
Tamanna, thank you for having me. And see, we have to understand the Indian IT Acts required a lot of changes given the ecosystem has changed drastically over the last 20 years. And the last amendment was done probably about last 13 years ago. So this was a high time that some new guidelines came about. There has been for the intermediary guidelines, there's been a lot of discussion and debate over the last 2 years, and they are finally out now. This is in addition to the existing guidelines. So there is some things that have been amended in that. And what we see is 3 things that you clearly identified in your own opening statements. The social media platforms need to have a lot more accountability, local governance. It's classified as minor platforms and major platforms. And of course, they need to be more transparent in their approach of if they're deplatformizing somebody. They need to follow the law of the land very, very strictly. And the gray areas are being removed in that. Similarly, for OTT platforms, with earlier there was a gray area whether they're governed by the IT ministry or by the INB ministry. It's very clear now it's INB ministry with this 3-layered approach of self-regulation, self-regulating body, and an oversight from the ministry. And the third thing, which is also very important, is that the pure play digital media companies also need to follow the same standards. It's a level playing field as any of the accredited journalists and journalist news publications follow. So I think overall it is bringing about a new framework, which is highly required. You have to understand India probably contributes, if not the highest amount, the number 1 or 2 sets of users to most of these platforms. And I think they were defying Indian laws. They were biased against India, not a particular thought process, biased against India by defying Indian laws very often. And I think right now, these steps are in the right direction to put a framework, to put out a clear policy and empower users and also make a level playing field for everybody.
Okay. Nikhil Pahwa, your comments. Do you think that it was time that these guidelines are brought into place to have a level playing field, and some of these sites were defying Indian law, as Arvind Gupta puts it? What is your response?
Well, Tamanna, I think it's very clear that the IT Act itself needs to be updated and upgraded. And it was clearly insufficient to deal with the change in the internet ecosystem. And it should be. But these guidelines are not a mechanism for putting in new regulatory frameworks that the IT Act itself does not enable or allow. So I'd like to see how the Parliament's subordinate legislation committee deals with this, because from at least from my non-legal reading of it, and I'd love to hear Raman Chima's take on this. These changes seem to be outside the ambit of what the IT Act allows. When it comes to traceability or the identification of the originator of the content, I'm a bit concerned, because under end-to-end encryption mechanisms, that's not a possibility. They will have to completely re-architect the technology of the platform to be able to identify an originator. And so that does create concerns related to privacy. If end-to-end encryption is removed, it means that our communications are not necessarily going to be safe or secure as they are currently. Lastly, on the streaming services regulation piece, I would just remind everyone that back in 2016 in the Supreme Court, Mukul Rohatgi had, the then Attorney General of India, had said that we don't want to regulate porn. We don't want to look at what people are watching in the privacy of their bedrooms, because it is all pull content. It's private viewing. Streaming services are also private viewing, and we watch them in the privacy of our bedroom. It's very different from broadcast, which is television, or films which are showcased in a theater. So you cannot apply the same framework to this kind of content, and it's some similar thing has been acknowledged by the Attorney General back in 2016. The government did not do any public consultation regarding OTT regulation. There is Mr. Javadekar in this press conference multiple times said that there is no regulatory framework in place for OTT streaming services, whereas there already is a self-regulatory framework which was released in July, which was an update on a 2019 framework. It's just that the ministry doesn't like the framework, so it's trying to impose a different one on them. And I don't think that's the right approach. They don't have, the INB ministry might have been given the mandate of regulating OTT streaming, but under what law are they regulating it? That's not very clear.
Let me take the legal question to Raman Chima. And this question has been raised through the day today. Would this require legislation in Parliament, or is the government well within its legislative rights to come out with guidelines to regulate this whole space?
Issue to take up, Tamanna, and that's the heart also of what the government's issued today and the problems with the entire approach. And unfortunately, it's a problem that's been made clear to them multiple times, and regrettably, they've gone ahead with it. India, as a constitutional democracy, allows the government to have certain powers, provide they respect fundamental rights, but again, provided you follow the proper process for it, including approval by elected lawmakers in a manner as would be approved in the Constitution. In this case, the government's not done that. In effect, the government, and if you look at the rules, they're like a mini act, like a mini act of parliament, but pushed through subordinate legislation, which has not been run past members of parliament. And as Nikhil mentioned, it has entire chapters that have never been publicly consulted upon, including about how it seeks to regulate online news services and curated content, namely video services, which has gone ahead and done. And that's the fundamental problem. You could not have done this through a subordinate legislation route. At the very least, you should have brought it into Parliament. And even there, whatever Parliament produced would have to be constitutional. And the important thing to remember here is these are lessons the government has actually learned. These very same rules were actually challenged and read down by the Indian Supreme Court back in March of 2015 during the somewhat now famous Shreya Singhal judgment, where the Supreme Court said, well, what the UPA administration had done was problematic, and they had to read down the rules there. And instead of learning from that, unfortunately, the Ministry of Electronics and IT and the Ministry of Information and Broadcasting has added entire chapters of significant powers, which frankly could never be brought in through subordinate rules. It's the equivalent of the executive branch choosing to subvert Parliament by what they're doing. And the very important point I want to make here is, in fact, I'm not the first one to say this. The first person to actually perhaps bring this to our attention was the late Arun Jaitley back in 2012, in the summer of 2012, where in Parliament, he stood up in support of a motion brought forward by a then communist member of Parliament who said the rules issued by the UPA administration were excessive and overbroad. And Mr. Jaitley stood up and said he was absolutely correct. And that's the sort of like philosophy that needs to guide what we're looking at today. And the ultimate thing I'll also leave you with, Tamanna, is the sort of powers the government has proposed here are significant and disproportionate. They create massive new obligations on not just businesses, but all types of different internet entities, and also directly impacts our rights. There are things from user privacy to surveillance powers to other measures which have been slowly added into these rules. And as was said to the Ministry of Electronics and IT in their ministry building when they held the consultation, some people said, we sympathize with your concerns, but this requires a law, and even that law may not be passed by MPs or may be changed. Why don't you do that? And it's very unfortunate that has not happened.
Tamanna, I would like
Arvind Gupta, if you want to come in on the specific question about, just one, let me come to Arvind Gupta, please. If I'd like you to come in on the specific point about, privacy of those sending messages. And all of you gentlemen, I request, let's keep the jargon down, say this as simply as possible, because this impacts all kinds of users. So let's not get tangled up in the legalese, if possible, to the extent possible. Arvind Gupta, so 2 points. One is that will your messages be safe if social media intermediaries have to say who the first originator is? Can that be misused? So that's concern number one. Concern number two is, in the case of OTT platforms, will a body of people interdepartmental, so essentially government, have the final say of what can and cannot be seen? So these are the two concerns. Do you think these are valid ones?
So let me respond by saying that if you have origination of content, and if you are, let's say, talking about obscenities, women's harassment, I think the government has the right to figure out where does this content originate from. And these are special cases where the government wants and would like to know that. And I think this privacy and surveillance bogey will not work in all cases. And this is something that we have heard so many times, that due to this whole concern of privacy and surveillance, the people who are impacted, and if you talk to them, and there is a Supreme Court discussion going on child pornography, and if you're doing that, and because of privacy and surveillance, we can't go after those perpetrators. I think I don't buy that argument. The second big point, Raman, let me complete what I'm saying is, the second big point is on the OTT side. I think it's a very clear self-governing mechanism, self-regulation mechanism. There is some indication on what kind of content should go and what kind of rating should be there. There is an oversight from the government, but mostly it is now giving the powers to the industry, to the individual OTT platforms, to first do their own due diligence, then work as an industry body together. And Nikhil mentioned that there is a body which does this, but he forgets to mention that there is a dispute within that body whether everybody prescribes to the same norms or not. So the government is trying to say we have standardized, let's bring out standardized norms. The self-regulatory bodies should be actually very well self-regulatory. The last point I would like to make is, the very, very important thing that we have to understand, especially in the context of social media, that most of what Raman was probably saying, that there is a lot of cost of compliance. The minor platforms have been left out with a huge cost of compliance, but the major platforms, as they're going to be defined, have so much of user business revenues coming from India. And we have seen some platforms who had that point in time about 30 crore users did not even have an office in India. And I think that is something that is not, that is something that India cannot take for granted. And we need local nodal officers, local grievance officers, and a transparency process that if you are blocking users or taking down pages, what have you done, and what is the grievance redressal mechanism for the users?
How do you justify it? Right.
Absolutely.
Right. You have two rebuttals coming in. I'm going to go to Nikhil Pava first. Yes, Nikhil.
One small correction. There is actually no dispute between various entities at the IMAI's OTT OCCP regulation. All streaming services that are a part of that
Nikhil,
have
then
signed on the latest code. They have signed on the latest code.
Why don't all of them put the certifications and the ratings?
Let's focus on the principles of it. Let's focus on the principles and the impact. Nikhil, I request you, let's focus on the principles and the impact. Let's not go into minutiae. Let's
I
focus
mean,
on principles and impact.
The impact is very, very clear. The government has a new stick to beat with. In case of social media platforms, in case of messaging platforms, they can now try and force those platforms to incorporate traceability of the originator of the message, even if the technology of that platform doesn't allow it. And in case of streaming services, now they have a mechanism by which they can nudge those bodies into censoring certain kinds of content that they don't want on those platforms. That the impact is very clear from a news media perspective. Instead of reducing regulation and restrictions that are there on existing news entities, they have now tried to create this entire regulatory framework without any public consultation, mind you. From the even when the FTI guidelines were announced, there was no public consultation. When the
Okay.
registration rules were announced last
I
year,
will
there was no public consultation. Now, when this has
I
happened, there's
will
been
have
no
to
public
end it here.
consultation. Not done public consultations on any
I
of the
will have
things
to
that are
end it here
mentioned
because
in
I've
this.
completely run out of time. Yes, I will have to end it here because we've completely run out of time. But I hope that through this conversation, that various points of view have reached our viewers, and we can take this forward and see how these policies and these regulations actually pan out over the next several weeks and months. Important to again reiterate what the government has emphasized time and again, that they plan to approach this with a soft touch approach. We'll see what that really eventually means. We'll take a very short break at this point, but on the other side, an interview you just don't want to miss. It's with Amit Agarwal, the country head of Amazon India. He is responding to a host of controversies and allegations that Amazon has faced in the recent days and all the reasons they've hit the headlines. He's also talking about the outlook of the company for India in 2021, right after this break.